Before diving into this story, become part of this space where secrets don't stay buried. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss narratives like this one, stories that disturb, provoke, and leave a mark. And write in the comments, where are you watching from? The Winchester house was set back from the main road in rural Maine, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to grow crooked on purpose, as if avoiding looking directly at the building. The place didn't draw attention at first glance, but there was something there that bothered anyone who lingered too long. A persistent feeling that the silence was watching back. Ethan Winchester was returning to that property after almost 15 years away. The car moved slowly along the gravel road, raising enough dust to erase the traces of the past, but not the weight he carried in his chest. The iron gate remained in the same place, rusty, leaning, creaking when pushed, as if protesting against the return of yet another Winchester to that land. On the other side of that story was Harold Moore, the man who now officially managed the property. A local real estate agent, too discreet for someone dealing with problematic properties. Moore wasn't a classic villain. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. His danger lay in how he knew too many secrets and asked too few questions. He knew what that house represented to the city, but he also knew how valuable it was to keep certain stories buried. Ethan parked in front of the porch. The wood creaked under his feet even before he climbed the steps, as if the house recognized him. There, in that very entrance, his grandfather had been found dead decades ago. Officially the victim of a domestic accident. Years later, his father met the same fate, falling down the stairs in circumstances so similar they bordered on the absurd. No autopsy ever mentioned coincidence, only bad luck. The city accepted these explanations far too easily. Inside the house, the air was heavy. There was no smell of mold, but something metallic lingered in the back of his throat, difficult to identify. The furniture was covered in white sheets, creating silhouettes reminiscent of motionless bodies scattered throughout the rooms. Ethan walked slowly, observing marks on the walls, old scratches, doors that didn't close properly, as if the house had never been fully completed or was always in a state of decay. The conflict wasn't expressed in words, but in interrupted gestures and avoided decisions. Ethan hadn't returned out of longing. He had returned because the same feeling that preceded his father's death was beginning to repeat itself within him. A persistent unease, sleepless nights, fragmented dreams, always ending in that house. Harold Moore arrived shortly after, parking his car with excessive care. He greeted Ethan with an overly firm handshake, surveying his surroundings before speaking. His eyes scanned the corners of the house, as if checking to see if anything had been moved. "Time has not been kind to this place," Moore said without emotion. Ethan simply nodded. The real conflict wasn't about the inheritance or the sale of the property, but about the choice Ethan was trying to postpone. To stay long enough to understand what was really happening there, or to leave again, pretending that it was all just a tragic succession of family accidents. Mystery lurked in the details. A basement locked from the inside, old documents missing from the father's office. Torn photographs, always in the same spot, as if someone wanted to erase a specific face from the family history. Nothing was explicit, but everything pointed to something that repeated itself with unsettling precision. The house didn't seem abandoned. It seemed to be waiting. Ethan realized this when he heard a dry sound coming from upstairs. A solitary, heavy footstep, impossible to ignore. Moore heard it too. Neither of them said anything. They both knew there was no one else there. The Winchester curse was never declared aloud. It manifested itself in silence, in repetition, in the way everyone acted as if it were too normal to be questioned. And now, once again, a Winchester was back at the beginning of it all. The town of Hollow Creek didn't appear on tourist maps or in national news reports. It was the kind of place that survived on the fringes of time, sustained by old habits and a selective collective memory. The houses were too well kept for an economically stagnant region, as if the appearance of normalcy were a silent rule. In Hollow Creek, asking too many questions was always seen as rude. Ethan realized this within the first few hours. At the local market, conversation ceased when he approached. Eye contact shifted with calculated swiftness. There was no explicit hostility, only a respectful, almost rehearsed distance. The Winchester surname still carried weight there, but not as prestige, as a warning. The Winchester family had helped found the town. Historical records confirmed land donations, funding of the local church, and active participation in the construction of the old sawmill, which employed half the population for decades. However, no document mentioned the family's decline, only the gradual disappearance of its members, always accompanied by overly simplistic official accounts. Ethan visited the municipal archives on a grey morning. The building was small and stuffy, with metal shelves crammed with poorly organized boxes. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Ruth Keller, recognized him instantly. Her smile was automatic, but her fingers tightened on the pen when he asked for access to the family records. She only handed over what was public: death certificates, deeds, old newspapers with discreet headlines. In all the deaths, the same pattern: falls, structural failures, domestic accidents, no prolonged investigation, no detailed forensic examination. What wasn't there attracted more attention than what was. Harold Moore reappeared that afternoon, walking around the property like someone who knew every inch of the grounds. He commented on the historical value of the house, on potential buyers interested in restoration, but avoided mentioning the basement. He always looked away when Ethan approached the door that led there. Moore wasn't just a broker. Gradually, Ethan discovered that he also brokered old documents, purchases of private archives, and anonymous donations to the local museum. He was the kind of man who kept the past under control, ensuring that certain versions of history remained intact. Other characters began to subtly reveal themselves. Thomas Reed, the former retired sheriff, now lived in seclusion on the outskirts of town. He was the one who had signed the final reports on the deaths of Ethan's father and grandfather. Reed avoided contact, but his presence loomed like a constant shadow, watching from a distance, always in silence. There was also Margaret Lowell, a history teacher at the local school, one of the few who still showed genuine curiosity about the past. She spoke carefully, choosing her words as if treading on shaky ground. It was she who mentioned, almost unintentionally, that not all the Winchesters had died in an accident. Some had simply disappeared from the records. The environment shaped the decisions. The Maine climate, with its long nights and oppressive winters, reinforced the feeling of isolation. The house, surrounded by dense forest, seemed to absorb sounds, making any movement excessively loud. Doors creaked more than they should. Steps gave way under the slightest weight. Nothing there failed, randomly. Ethan began to notice small changes. Objects moved around. Lights remained on in rooms he hadn't visited. Recent marks appeared over old ones, as if someone were updating the house's history. The secondary characters weren't trying to drive him away directly. On the contrary, they encouraged him to stay with practical justifications, settling the inheritance, organizing documents, evaluating the sale. Each suggestion seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a web that kept him trapped there. Moore's motivation was becoming clearer. As long as the house remained under control, Hollow Creek remained safe. Not from something supernatural, but from the truth. Whatever had started with the Winchesters needed to continue being treated as a coincidence. Ethan didn't confront anyone. He observed. He noted details. He knew that any rash move would shatter a fragile balance that the city had maintained for generations. Hollow Creek didn't just hide a secret, it hid a silent agreement between all who remained alive. And the Winchester house was the center of that pact. Ethan's stay in the house began to produce almost immediate effects. There were no explosions of tension or direct confrontations, but the town's routine subtly adjusted to his presence, as if Hollow Creek were recalculating risks. Unexpected visits became frequent, always with simple justifications, always without warning. On the third night, the first concrete obstacle appeared. The basement, which had remained locked until then, was open. The door showed no signs of forced entry. It simply gave way, silently, as if it had been unlocked by someone who possessed the key, or who had never needed it. Ethan descended a few steps, stopping when he felt the air change. The metallic smell was stronger down there. There was no mess, no objects out of place, just wooden boxes stacked with excessive precision. In one of them, he found old family records, diaries, contracts, letters never sent. Many documents had been scribbled on with the same dark ink, always concealing specific names. The conflict was taking shape. Someone had tried to control what he could discover, but had failed to eliminate everything. The next day, Harold Moore showed up far too early. His gaze went straight to the basement door before he even greeted Ethan. He talked about buyers, about legal deadlines, about how the house wasn't safe to stay in alone. Each argument seemed more urgent than necessary. Ethan responded with actions, not words. He locked the basement again, changed the padlock, and kept the documents with him. That decision provoked the first visible reaction. Moore lost his neutral tone for a few seconds, too quickly to be called an explosion, too slowly to go unnoticed. Other obstacles arose. The power supply went out repeatedly, always at night. The landlines stopped working at the most inopportune times. Secondary roads were blocked by trees that had fallen too recently to be natural. Nothing seemed serious in isolation, but together they formed a silent siege. Secondary characters began to interfere more actively. Margaret Lowell tried to warn him without saying exactly what about. She spoke of historical patterns and recurring accidents while leafing through old books, avoiding eye contact. Thomas Reed, the former sheriff, appeared on the balcony one night just to observe. He didn't enter. He didn't speak. His presence was enough to make it clear that Ethan was crossing unseen boundaries. The internal conflict also intensified, but without long monologues. Ethan began to sleep little, reacting to any minimal noise. The house seemed to respond to his movements. Doors creaked when he moved away. Steps gave way when he stepped exactly where he didn't expect. There were no visible ghosts, only the constant feeling of being watched by something that knew his habits. The investigation progressed when Ethan noticed a pattern in the erased records. The hidden names always belonged to the same 3 founding families of the town, including his own. People who had held positions of authority, responsible for decisions that shaped Hollow Creek in its early decades. The antagonism ceased to be abstract. It wasn't just Moore. It was a system sustained for generations, in which the Winchester's sacrifice served as a convenient distraction. Each death reinforced the narrative of hereditary bad luck, diverting attention from something bigger that should never be revisited. Tensions rose when one of the documents mentioned a meeting held in the basement of the house decades ago, involving local leaders and an agreement that was never formalized. The record ended abruptly, torn by hand, as if someone had forcibly interrupted the writing. That same night, someone tried to break into the house. There was no sound of forced entry, just the doorknob turning slowly, testing its limits. Ethan remained motionless, clutching an improvised tool while footsteps circled outside. When the silence returned, something had changed. The feeling was no longer one of passive observation, it was one of warning. The conflict made it clear. Continuing meant confronting not only living people, but a past that Hollow Creek refused to fully bury. Retreating, on the other hand, meant accepting that the next death in the Winchester family was already foreseen, and for the first time, Ethan understood that his presence there was not a mistake. It was a threat to the city's equilibrium. The subplots began to reveal themselves not as deviations from the main narrative, but as threads intertwined in the same ancient knot that held Hollow Creek together. Each relationship, each seemingly isolated gesture, reinforced the feeling that nothing in that town existed by chance. The first subplot developed from Margaret Lowell. The teacher began visiting the house more frequently, always bringing books or documents forgotten in the school archives. She never stayed long. She never remained after sunset. In small fragments, she let slip that her own grandfather had participated in closed meetings in the early years of the city. He wasn't a Winchester, but he had helped legitimize decisions that officially never existed. Margaret wasn't seeking redemption. Her interest was survival. She knew that questioning too much had cost others dearly in the past. Still, she kept returning, driven by a feeling that mixed inherited guilt and real fear. This subplot deepened the main conflict by showing that the curse wasn't just a family tragedy, but a shared consequence, accepted for convenience. Another layer emerged with Thomas Reed. The former sheriff didn't approach Ethan directly, but his actions spoke for him. Patrol cars began circulating more frequently near the property. Old reports started disappearing from the municipal archives. Reed wasn't trying to stop Ethan, only to limit the time he had to make his move. The time pressure became explicit when Moore informed him that the sale of the house needed to be finalized within a few weeks. Legal documents surfaced with advanced deadlines. Unexpected fees appeared. The justification was bureaucratic, but the effect was clear. Either Ethan acted quickly, or he would be forced to leave. Meanwhile, the house itself revealed another subplot. Small symbols carved into the basement beams began to attract attention. They weren't religious, nor were they random. They were repeated at specific structural points, always associated with supporting reinforcements. That house hadn't been built just to live in. It had been designed to support something: meetings, secrets, perhaps deaths. Ethan connected these markings to old city records, realizing that buildings belonging to the founding families shared the same pattern. The Winchester house was simply the oldest, and the only one still intact. Personal relationships also became more strained. Margaret began to avoid direct contact, leaving anonymous notes in books or newspapers. Moore adopted a more aggressive, albeit restrained, tone. Reed finally spoke, but only one sentence uttered without emotion on the sidewalk in front of the house. Some stories need an ending, even if it's the wrong one. No subplot stretched beyond what was necessary. Each one pushed Ethan toward the same conclusion: time was not neutral. The longer he stayed, the more the city reacted. The weather reinforced this. Constant rains isolated the property. Trails were covered in mud. Access to the main road became unpredictable. Hollow Creek seemed to collaborate in the siege, as if the environment were complicit in the silent pact. All the subplots converged on a common point. The agreement made in the past could not be broken without immediate consequences. There was no room for emotional escape or negotiations. The city needed a Winchester there, present, vulnerable, silent. Ethan realized he wasn't just investigating a curse. He was filling a role that someone had always needed to fill. The question is no longer asked, with something would happen. It became when. The turning point didn't come with immediate violence, but with a discovery that rearranged everything Ethan believed he was facing. The house wasn't the central problem. It was merely the place where the truth had been most carefully hidden. The change began when a storm isolated Hollow Creek for nearly 2 days. Power lines went down, back roads disappeared under landslides, and cell phone service became useless. The town became too quiet, as if it had been disconnected from the rest of the world by choice. During the early hours of the second night, Ethan heard the sound coming from the basement again, not footsteps, something heavier being dragged. Going down, he found one of the boxes out of place, open. Inside it, there was a false compartment that he hadn't noticed before. What he found there was neither a diary nor a contract. It was an old recording, on magnetic tape, protected by layers of cloth and wax. Alongside it was a short letter, written by his grandfather himself, in shaky but conscious handwriting. He wasn't talking about a curse, he was talking about a purpose. The recording revealed the meeting the records mentioned. Voices familiar to those who grew up in Hollow Creek. Local leaders, religious authorities, representatives of the founding families. The agreement was simple and brutal. Whenever a collective wrong threatened to come to light, covered-up crimes, lands seized by force, necessary deaths, responsibility would be shifted to a single lineage. The Winchesters would accept bearing the public burden of the tragedy. The deaths weren't random. They were induced, carefully staged as domestic accidents, whenever the city needed to divert attention. The basement had served as a decision-making room, and later as a control archive. The house didn't curse anyone, it merely remembered. The most disturbing revelation came at the end of the tape. The voice of Ethan's younger father, firm, declared that the agreement needed to end. He had tried to get out of the role that had been imposed on him. A few months later, he died on the stairs. The impact was immediate. There were no screams or prolonged emotional breakdown. There was action. Ethan understood that remaining passive would put him on the same path. The difference now was knowledge. Before I could react, the city reacted first. Moore appeared in the middle of the storm, soaked, accompanied by Reed. There was no direct threat. Just a final proposal presented as a practical necessity. Sell the house, hand over the documents, close the chapter cleanly. Ethan's refusal was silent. He simply turned off the recording in front of them. The silence that followed was too heavy to ignore. Reed didn't argue. Moore didn't insist. They both understood that the balance had been broken. The real turning point was clear. The curse wasn't haunting the Winchesters. It depended on them, and, for the first time, a Winchester knew exactly how everything worked. The revelation didn't cause immediate chaos. What came after was more dangerous: reorganization. Hollow Creek didn't panic, but began to move like a wounded organism trying to protect itself. Nothing happened in plain sight. Everything changed in the details. The morning after Moore and Reed's visit, Ethan found the property fence partially knocked down. It wasn't obvious vandalism, but an opening large enough to suggest neglect. Hours later, he received an informal notice from the city alleging structural risks to the house, requiring a mandatory inspection. No clear signature, no negotiable deadline. The city was beginning to react to Ethan's actions with actions of its own. Margaret Lowell stopped showing up. Her notes ceased. The school phone rang unanswered. When Ethan drove past her house, he noticed the lights had been off for days. There was no official announcement of a trip or leave of absence. She simply disappeared from the scene. Moore began acting as an intermediary to exert pressure. Lawyers appeared with ready-made documents. Purchase offers were inflated, accompanied by warnings about legal costs and liabilities. Nothing illegal, just suffocating. Each move made it clear that Ethan wasn't confronting individuals, but an entire structure. The reactions were also psychological. Sounds in the house became more frequent and precise. Doors slammed shut exactly when he approached. Steps gave way at strategic points. It wasn't an attempt to kill him, yet. It was attrition, a repetition of the method used with his father. Thomas Reed returned to the property at nightfall. This time, he went inside. He walked down the hall without looking around, as if he already knew every corner. He said only what was necessary. "You don't understand what happens when that paper is blank." The phrase wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. The consequences also affected Ethan's inner balance. Physical exhaustion accumulated, but his attitude had changed. He began to record everything, copy documents, prepare duplicates. The city's reaction confirmed the validity of the discovery. If it were a lie, there wouldn't be so much effort to silence him. The house reacted differently now. The atmosphere had ceased to be merely oppressive and had become almost functional. as if it responded better to those who knew its purpose. Stuck drawers began to open easily. Hidden compartments were revealed effortlessly. The house was not defending the city. It was defending secrecy. The clearest consequence came when Ethan found a new document in the basement, intentionally left there. It wasn't old, just a few days old. A simple minutes without official letterhead, listing current names, an update to the agreement. At the end, a blank space, reserved for the next Winchester. The system was ready to move forward, with or without consent. Ethan's reaction was neither escape nor immediate confrontation. It was preparation. He understood that breaking the cycle would require something more dangerous than exposing the truth, demanding that the city bear the weight of its own destiny. The consequences were clear. The conflict had ceased to be an investigation. It had become inevitable. Ethan's change didn't happen abruptly. There was no moment of theatrical courage, no grand decision announced aloud. His growth manifested itself in practical choices made under constant pressure as the net closed in around the house. He stopped reacting to the city's movements and began anticipating them. The first action was to establish control over time. Ethan organized the documents found in the basement, created physical and digital copies, and stored them in separate locations outside the property. Every time he left the house, he had a clear purpose. There were no more random walks or impulsive trips to town. Everything was calculated. The second challenge was internal. The Winchester's pattern had always been silent isolation, the gradual acceptance of their imposed role. Ethan broke with this by seeking unlikely allies, not the powerful, but the forgotten. Former sawmill employees, older residents far from the city centre, people who had lost something during the same periods when a Winchester had suffered an accident. These encounters weren't emotional, they were objective. Fragmented stories, coinciding dates, repeated names. Ethan's growth lay in listening without promising salvation. He offered no justice, only visibility. New challenges quickly arose. One of these residents died days later, officially from natural causes. The message was clear. The system reacted whenever someone got too close. The difference now was that Ethan didn't back down. The house ceased to be a refuge and became an operational base. He used the hidden compartments to conceal evidence, reorganizing the basement not as a memory space, but as an active archive. The house, which had previously seemed like a trap, now functioned as a tool. Ethan's personal evolution was evident in how he dealt with fear. He didn't ignore it, nor did he try to overcome it. He incorporated it into his decisions. He slept little, but in a planned way. He maintained irregular routines so as not to be predictable, small adjustments that indicated someone who had learned to survive within his own imposed role. Moore tried one last indirect approach, sending an emissary with a more aggressive proposal. Enough money to disappear and never again be associated with the Winchester name. Ethan refused without confrontation. The refusal wasn't heroic, it was practical. Accepting would mean leaving the system intact. Growth solidified when Ethan realized he didn't need to destroy Hollow Creek. He needed to expose it to its own reflection. His goal ceased to be personal, it became structural. He wasn't seeking immediate revenge or family redemption. He was seeking to break the system. By consciously assuming the role that had always been subtly imposed upon him, Ethan ceased to be a victim of the curse and became its breaking point. The cycle only worked as long as Winchester remained unconscious. Now there was someone willing to carry the burden to the end, not in silence, but in light sufficient for all to see. The preparation wasn't marked by speeches or grand plans. It manifested itself in the acceleration of events, as if time had run out of patience. Hollow Creek began to move with less caution, and that betrayed the urgency. The first subplot to be resolved was that of Margaret Lowell. Ethan discovered, through school records, that she had neither requested leave nor a transfer. Officially, she remained an employee. Unofficially, she had been removed from social interaction without leaving any formal trace. The silence surrounding her name confirmed something essential. Those who stepped out of their designated role did not disappear by accident. They were removed. Ethan gathered all the evidence into a single point: the recording, the old minutes, the updated records of the agreement, and the accounts collected from the oldest residents. None of this was sufficient in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to justify as coincidence. Tensions rose when the city announced an emergency inspection of the house, scheduled for 2 days later. The order included the possibility of immediate closure of the property. It was the final push. If the house was sealed off, the basement, the core of the system, would be lost. Thomas Reed appeared for the last time that night. He didn't come alone. 2 men were waiting in a car without identification. Reed didn't try to convince Ethan. He only informed him that the process was underway and that resisting would have irreversible consequences. Ethan didn't answer. The answer was in motion. During the early morning hours, he removed what he still needed from the house and left the rest visible, almost provocatively. He no longer hid anything. The preparation required calculated exposure. He knew that the climax wouldn't happen in the basement or in the house, but in front of the entire city. The atmosphere heightened the tension. A dense fog covered Hollow Creek at dawn, delaying movement and muffling sounds. The town seemed suspended, as if awaiting an external decision. Small events accumulated: distant sirens, unannounced meetings, cars driving aimlessly. The final subplots were resolved without dramatization. The residents who had spoken with Ethan disappeared from the public eye, but their stories were recorded. Moore stopped mediating. He began to observe. When someone stops negotiating, it's because they believe the outcome is already decided. Ethan was ready because there was nothing left to delay. The gears were turning too fast for fine-tuning. The city needed immediate closure, and he knew exactly when and where it would happen. The preparation wasn't about surviving the climax. It was to ensure that when it came, it could not be reversed. The climax didn't happen at the Winchester house. The house had already served its purpose. It occurred in the center of Hollow Creek, in the only space where the town still pretended to be just a town. The old community hall, used for public assemblies since its founding. The inspection announced by the City Hall discreetly turned into an extraordinary meeting. Summonses were issued without official records, passed from mouth to mouth. Ethan knew this even before leaving the house. The system needed to close the situation with apparent legitimacy. When he entered the hall, the atmosphere was already set. There was no crowd, just the right people: local officials, representatives of the founding families, Moore, Reed, and a few new faces, replacements ready to keep the deal running. The general public was absent. This had never been about them. Ethan didn't bring speeches. He brought evidence. The protagonist's transformation became visible in his first gesture. He didn't ask to speak. He occupied the space. He placed the original recording, the old documents, and the recent minutes with the space reserved for his name on the central table. Each item was arranged calmly, like inevitable pieces. Moore tried to interrupt, but was ignored. Reed noticed before the others. Silence fell as the recording began to play. Voices from the past filled the hall, echoing decisions that no one there had dared to publicly acknowledge. The impact wasn't emotional. It was structural. Some attendees tried to discredit the material, but the strategy failed when Ethan presented the correspondences of dates, deaths, and direct political benefits. The pattern was too clear. The twist came when he revealed something no one expected. Complete copies had been sent that very morning to external agencies: investigative journalists, federal prosecutors, independent archives. The gear stopped. The agreement had always worked, because everything remained internal. By breaking that rule, Ethan took away the city's greatest weapon, control of the narrative. There was no violence, no immediate arrest. There was contained panic, exchanged glances, futile attempts to regain control. Thomas Reed spoke last, not to deny it, but to admit the inevitable. He simply said that someone would always pay the price. Ethan replied without raising his voice. No more silence. The transformation was complete there. He ceased to be the heir to the curse and became the agent of the rupture. The climax was not an explosion, but an internal collapse, the moment when Hollow Creek realized it had survived for decades at the cost of a conscious sacrifice. When Ethan left the hall, no one tried to stop him. The city had just lost its scapegoat. The consequences were neither immediate nor spectacular. Hollow Creek didn't collapse the following night, nor did sirens fill the streets at dawn. What happened was slower and more definitive. The investigations began beyond the city's reach. Federal agencies took over the investigation without public notice. Influential people quietly left their posts. Others suddenly fell ill, withdrawing before they were formally summoned. Moore disappeared from the local real estate market as if he had never existed there. Reed put his house up for sale and left without saying goodbye. The Winchester house was finally sealed off, but not as a threat. It became evidence. For the first time, no one tried to hide its history. The basement, once a space of control, became an official record of what Hollow Creek was forced to face. Ethan stayed in town only long enough to finish what he had started. He didn't become a local hero or a public symbol. His name appeared in reports, not on plaques. The curse ceased to exist because it ceased to be useful. The residents reacted in different ways. Some denied it until the end. Others accepted it silently. Many understood too late that collective comfort always comes at a human cost. In the long run, Hollow Creek changed without realizing it. Selective silence was replaced by genuine caution. Stories previously suppressed began to emerge, not out of sudden courage, but because the mechanism that had suppressed them had been dismantled. For Ethan, the most profound consequence was internal. He didn't free himself from the past. He reorganized it. He now carried not an imposed burden, but a deliberate choice. There was no catharsis or full redemption, only continuity without submission. The Winchester family is no longer synonymous with inherited bad luck. It became proof that cycles only persist as long as no one is willing to interrupt them. Months later, Hollow Creek reappeared on maps only as an irrelevant point. The town was still standing, but without the comfortable certainty of before. Some houses were empty. Others changed hands too quickly. Ethan Winchester never slept on the old property again. The house remained closed, preserved for record-keeping purposes, not as a home. Yet, in certain reports, his name appeared associated with the place, as a reminder that not all silence is oblivion. Hollow Creek moved on, but with the lingering feeling that something essential had been taken away. Perhaps that was the price of surviving without lies. If this story provoked discomfort, that's no coincidence. Narratives like Hollow Creek's don't just speak of fictional towns, but of real mechanisms that survive on collective silence and unquestioned repetition. Reflect on how many truths are kept from the light in the name of stability, tradition, or convenience. Think about the roles we inherit without choosing, and the cost of accepting them without question. If this storyline helped you see patterns, share your interpretation. Every story gains new layers when viewed through different eyes. And above all, ask yourself, if the weight were on your shoulders, would you remain silent or break the cycle?